On May 9th, nearly 400 earthquakes rattled California's Imperial Valley, a swarm centered in the Brawley seismic area between the southern tip of the San Andreas Fault and the Imperial Fault Zone. A magnitude 4.5 on May 9th, and another immediately following at 4.7, just after midnight on May 10th. Seismologists monitoring the swarm said this could trigger a major San Andreas rupture. The possibility remains uncertain, however. That language shows up in a lot of earthquake coverage. It's accurate, but it also may be describing the wrong part of the fault. Because while the swarm was shaking the southern end of the San Andreas system, research published earlier this month in the journal Geosphere was changing the conversation about the northern end, 700 miles away where the San Andreas terminates near the California-Oregon border. About what happens to that section of the fault, not when it builds up its own pressure, but when a completely different fault system fires first. When the Cascadia Subduction Zone ruptures, the San Andreas sometimes follows. Not sometimes as in occasionally. Across 3,000 years of geological history and roughly half of the major Cascadia earthquakes Goldfinger's team studied, the sediment record shows a San Andreas rupture following in close temporal proximity. And in the majority of those paired events, the turbidite layers sit so close together that geologists classify them as doublets, two earthquakes firing within hours of each other. Not years, not decades, hours. The Cascadia Subduction Zone has ruptured in major earthquakes roughly 43 times over the past 10,000 years. The last one was 326 years ago. The fault's historical recurrence interval ranges from 200 to 500 years, which means it is already within the range where rupture has historically occurred. Federal probability estimates put the odds of a magnitude 7.1 or greater Cascadia earthquake at 37% over the next 50 years. That 37% figure was built around a single fault scenario. Research published this month suggests the scenario may be a doublet. Two of the most dangerous fault systems in the world, Cascadia in the Pacific Northwest and San Andreas through California, potentially triggering within hours of each other. Seattle and Portland still shaking while San Francisco and Los Angeles begin their own earthquake response. 50 million people. Two simultaneous federal disasters. One response system not built for either of them at this scale, let alone both at once. This is what the research actually says. To understand how two fault systems can trigger each other, you need to understand what each one is. The Cascadia Subduction Zone runs 700 miles off the Pacific coast, from northern California through Oregon and Washington to the southern tip of British Columbia. It marks where the Juan de Fuca tectonic plate dives beneath the North American plate. The two plates are locked together. The Juan de Fuca plate wants to slide downward. Friction holds it in place. So the stress accumulates, year after year, decade after decade, century after century. When it releases, it doesn't release gradually, it releases all at once. The San Andreas Fault runs 800 miles through California, from its northern terminus near Cape Mendocino south through the Salinas Valley, past Los Angeles to the Salton Sea. It is a different kind of fault entirely. Where Cascadia involves plates diving beneath each other, San Andreas involves plates grinding horizontally past each other. The Pacific Plate moves northwest relative to the North American Plate at roughly 2 inches per year. On a map, the two faults look like they connect. Their endpoints are separated by about 100 miles of Northern California coastline. Cape Mendocino, where the San Andreas terminates, sits directly south of where Cascadia's influence ends. For decades, scientists treated them as independent systems. Separate threat profiles, separate probability estimates, separate emergency plans. The assumption was that what happened on one fault stayed on one fault. Goldfinger's research suggests that assumption was wrong. The most precisely documented case of both faults firing together happened on the night of January 26, 1700. The exact time is known because of Japanese records. A tsunami crossed the Pacific Ocean and struck the coast of Japan, powerful enough to destroy coastal villages, flood rice paddies, and kill people who had no idea what had caused the waves. Japanese officials recorded the event in detail. They couldn't explain it because no earthquake had been felt in Japan. The origin was an ocean away. Centuries later, geologists matched those Japanese tsunami records to the Cascadia Subduction Zone. The ghost forests helped. Along the Pacific Northwest coast, entire stands of Sitka spruce had drowned in place when coastal land subsided up to 6 feet during the rupture. Those trees, still standing, still rooted, could be carbon dated. The dates matched Japan's records. A magnitude 9.0 earthquake, January 26, 1700, 9 p.m. local time. Confirmed. Most people who know this story stop there. Here's the part that wasn't documented until Goldfinger's research. A San Andreas earthquake occurred in 1700 too. In California's geological record, written in the same ocean floor sediment layers that Goldfinger's team analyzed, the signature of a San Andreas rupture appears in 1700 within the same narrow window as the Cascadia event. One night, both faults, the West Coast's two most dangerous systems firing in sequence, and 1700 was not an anomaly, it was the pattern. Goldfinger's methodology is worth understanding because it is the foundation of everything the research claims. He reads the ocean floor like a document. His tool is what geologists call turbidites. When a large earthquake strikes, it shakes sediment loose from underwater canyon walls and slopes. That sediment cascades to the deep ocean floor and settles into a characteristic layer. Coarser particles first, finer particles on top. The whole deposit preserved in sequence for thousands of years. A turbidite is an earthquake's signature written in sediment. Different faults leave different signatures. Cascadia earthquakes, originating offshore across a wide front, deposit fine-grained layers. San Andreas earthquakes, originating on a narrower onshore fault, deposit coarser material with a different mineral composition. A doublet event creates a distinctive sandwich. A fine Cascadia layer immediately beneath a coarser San Andreas layer, with almost nothing between them. Goldfinger's team pulled 130 sediment cores from multiple ocean floor locations and read 3,000 years of turbidite sequences. The same pattern appeared again and again. Not in every event, not in every core, but in 10 of the 18 major Cascadia sequences studied, roughly half, a San Andreas signature followed close behind. And in 8 of those 10 paired events, the layers were stacked so tightly the team classified them as doublets. The two earthquakes firing within hours of each other, consistent across thousands of years and across independent sampling locations. The mechanism that explains it is called stress transfer. When Cascadia releases centuries of accumulated stress, the energy doesn't stop at the fault boundary. It redistributes through the crust, rippling outward, loading adjacent geological structures with the transferred pressure. The northern San Andreas Fault, already under its own accumulated stress from decades of plate movement, lies directly in the path of that redistribution. For a fault already loaded and close to its breaking point, the additional stress from Cascadia's release may be the increment that crosses the threshold. The crust doesn't respect the boundaries we draw on maps. It redistributes stress according to physics, and the geometry of the California coastline puts the northern San Andreas precisely where Cascadia's stress redistribution lands. Here's what Cascadia alone looks like. Before we add the doublet, a 2022 federal planning exercise projected approximately 14,000 fatalities from a full Cascadia rupture, more than 100,000 injuries and the severe damage or collapse of roughly 620,000 buildings across Oregon and Washington. That includes 100 hospitals and more than 2,000 schools. On the Oregon coast, 440,000 residential buildings face damage, a quarter of which would be uninhabitable without major repair. Tsunami waves could strike coastal communities within 15 to 30 minutes of the earthquake. Seaside Oregon faces projections of more than 4,000 casualties from the tsunami alone. Emergency planners have estimated that affected areas will be without basic services and outside assistance for at least 2 weeks after the event. That is the Cascadia scenario, by itself. Now add the doublet. Goldfinger has described the combined scenario directly. An earthquake on either fault alone would draw down the resources of the entire country to respond to it. If both go off together, San Francisco, Portland, Seattle, and Vancouver could all be in an emergency situation simultaneously. Think through what that actually means. The National Guard units that would stage in California to support Pacific Northwest disaster response are now responding to their own disaster. The federal disaster declarations routing personnel northward are processing two competing emergencies at once. The hospitals in Sacramento and San Jose that would take the overflow of Cascadia casualties have their own earthquake damage and their own surge. Mutual aid between states assumes some states are unaffected. In a doublet scenario, no major West Coast state is unaffected. The entire framework of how the United States responds to regional disasters, the assumption that unaffected regions can absorb and support affected ones, does not hold if both coasts of the same seismic system fire within hours. This is not catastrophism. It is the planning implication of a pattern that appears in 8 of 10 historical Cascadia events. It is a real probability attached to a real, documented mechanism. And until 2025, it was not part of the standard planning scenario. Here is what is in place. Shake Alert, the U.S. Geological Survey's earthquake early warning system, is now operational across California, Oregon, and Washington. When a major earthquake begins, Shake Alert detects the initial seismic waves and sends warnings to phones, emergency systems, and automated industrial controls before the stronger shaking arrives. For a Cascadia earthquake, coastal residents could receive between 10 and 60 seconds of warning. 10 seconds is enough time to drop, cover, and hold on. It is enough for trains to slow automatically, for hospital surgical suites to pause procedures, for gas lines to shut off. It does not evacuate a building, but it saves lives at the margin, and that margin is real. Oregon and Washington have passed updated seismic building codes, prioritizing schools and hospitals in high-risk zones. Hundreds of older, unreinforced masonry buildings have been retrofitted. Tsunami evacuation routes are marked on coastal roads. The Japanese concept of tsunami tendenko, everyone immediately runs to high ground without waiting for family members, trusting that family members are doing the same, has been adopted as official guidance in several Oregon coastal communities. The lesson came from Japan's 2011 Tohoku earthquake, where communities with pre-established evacuation culture had dramatically lower death tolls than communities that hadn't internalized the drills. It is a transferable lesson, and parts of the Pacific Northwest have taken it seriously. These investments are real, they matter. Here is what they do not do. They do not prevent structural collapse in buildings that haven't been retrofitted. Across Oregon and Washington, the majority of older unreinforced masonry buildings, apartments, commercial buildings, government facilities built before modern seismic codes, have not been upgraded. The funding has not been sufficient. The timeline has not been fast enough. Shake Alert gives 10 to 60 seconds. A full Cascadia rupture shakes the ground for 4 to 6 minutes. For anyone inside a building with inadequate seismic performance, the warning arrives seconds before an outcome. That warning alone doesn't change. And emergency planning built around Cascadia assumes California functions as a resource pool, an unaffected neighboring system that sends personnel, equipment, and hospital capacity northward. Goldfinger's research makes that assumption structurally incorrect in the majority of historical Cascadia scenarios. The preparedness work that has been done is meaningful. It is not sufficient for what the geological record shows is possible. There are two versions of how this plays out. In the first, Cascadia doesn't rupture in the near term. The preparedness investments compound. More buildings retrofitted, more coastal communities trained, Shake Alert coverage extended and refined. Emergency management protocols are updated to model the doublet as a baseline scenario rather than an outlier. Mutual aid frameworks are restructured to account for California as a simultaneous disaster zone. By the time the fault fires, the Pacific Northwest and California have both closed their most critical gaps, the doublet fires, both disasters are catastrophic. Recovery takes years, but the death toll is a fraction of what the unmitigated scenario would produce. In the second, the fault fires before the gaps close. The buildings that haven't been retrofitted fail. Coastal communities that didn't internalize evacuation culture wait for family members instead of running. The mutual aid frameworks that didn't model simultaneous disasters route resources to the wrong places in the first 72 hours. The window when most survival decisions are made, the doublet fires within hours, two simultaneous federal disaster declarations. Response systems stretched past their design limits before the first weekends. History has already run this experiment. The 2011 Tohoku earthquake killed roughly 18,000 people. Japan is the most earthquake-prepared nation in the world. the most sophisticated early warning technology, the strictest building codes, the deepest cultural preparedness. A magnitude 9.0 still killed 18,000 people. Preparation doesn't prevent the event, it changes the outcome within the event. The 2010 Haiti earthquake measured magnitude 7.0, considerably smaller. It killed more than 200,000 people. The same physics, a different level of preparation, a different outcome by 2 orders of magnitude. The Pacific Northwest has the same choice Japan made. That choice is being made right now, in budget decisions about which buildings get retrofitted, in community decisions about whether evacuation drills happen, in policy decisions about how mutual aid compacts are written. The earthquake is not a decision. What it hits is, Chris Goldfinger spent years reading ocean floor sediment cores and found 3,000 years of evidence that Cascadia and San Andreas don't always act alone. That finding is now in the hands of emergency planners, seismic engineers, and state emergency management offices. Mutual aid frameworks are being reviewed. Probability models are being updated. The planning picture is changing. What hasn't changed is the fault itself. Cascadia will rupture. The geological record is unambiguous on that point. The only question has ever been when and whether the region is ready. Goldfinger's research adds a second question: whether California is ready for what may follow within hours. The preparation window is open right now, not indefinitely. So here's what I want you to sit with. If you live in the Pacific Northwest or California, what would it take to be actually ready? Not vaguely planning to be ready someday, but actually ready. 2 weeks of water and food stored, a known evacuation route you've walked, not just seen on a map, a family plan that works without cell service. The research found the mechanism. The planning is being updated. The one variable still entirely under your control is the one closest to home. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We cover the forces reshaping our world, the ones that don't make the evening news but probably should.